The business of college sports have undergone tectonic shifts in recent years, and there is quite frankly an earthquake ahead. In the next couple of weeks, a number of federal cases will be settled. We expect that will change college sports, change NIL as we know it. They are the House, Carter, Hubbard versus the NCAA. How will this change the sports and the athletes you love? Nobody better to talk about that than with the president of the NCAA and the former governor of Massachusetts, who I have to say left Massachusetts just a couple of years ago with a 68% approval rating as a Republican governor in a highly blue state. Just think about that for a moment in today's divisive atmosphere. It sounds impossible. Charlie, great to have you. Are you still astonished that you left a blue state with a 68% approval rating?
Look, I was always incredibly grateful that the voters in Massachusetts gave me a second chance after I lost when I ran for governor in 2010. I clearly wasn't playing in any atmosphere like that at that time. We had a great team. We had great relationships with our colleagues in local government. And honestly, I think the biggest thing we did was we just didn't, we tried really hard not to engage in a lot of this stuff that people in politics tend to get trapped in, which is the back and forth that a lot of voters look at and just say, you're not really helping me with my rent or my mortgage or my job or my income or my bag of groceries. And we tried pretty hard to focus on the stuff that people cared about. And I was incredibly grateful for the support we got.
Well, as a guy with the 617 area code, very much appreciate the work you did there and the work you are doing here with the NCAA. These cases, which will be settled, we believe, in the
Yeah.
next couple of weeks, as early as April 7th, change NIL as we know it, not just looking forward, but looking back. And Charlie, let's start with looking back. A $2.8 billion settlement, I believe, will be dispersed among the programs. How so, and how will that money get divvied up?
So the first thing to remember here is that this is, as you point out, a pretty tectonic moment. The back damages were negotiated with the plaintiffs, and it's basically 2.8 billion over 10 years, so it's 280 million a year. And the class that was represented on the back damages was about 40,000 student athletes, and I think less than 200 didn't sign up. So as classes go, it's an extraordinary level of participation, which is a big statement that a lot of the young people who are involved in this were anxious to participate. And it goes back to some of the original cases here, which are 10 years ago, which is why you have such a big class. And the plaintiffs make the decisions about how the money actually gets distributed. But I think for all intents and purposes, the national office is going to put in at least 40% of that every year. We're hoping we'll be able to do more. And the rest of it is divided among all the schools in D1.
So guys that played 5 and 10 years ago will get what, $100,000, or how will that work?
The plaintiffs basically have to make the decision about how the distribution works. And I would really urge you to talk to them about it. It's not something we're supposed to pony up the money to make the payments possible, but the decision about how that funding gets distributed is up to them.
Boy, is that going to be a difficult task to manage. Moving forward, there will also be what we believe and what has been rumored to between $20 and $22 million per school dispersed to pay the athletes, primarily college football and college basketball players. Is that how you understand it will work? And once again, will that be up to the schools and conferences' discretion as to how to disperse that money?
So the way to think about the back damages piece, 2.8 billion over 10 years, goes to a collection of about 40,000 athletes, and the distribution, the plaintiffs and their lawyers make the decision about how the distribution works. The go forward piece is, and remember, we got preliminary approval on this from the judge in October. We still need final approval. So if I tend to put all my stuff in sort of a little bit of a contingent category, that's why. I mean, we're certainly hoping she'll approve the final settlement, and your date on that is sometime in April is correct. But the way to think about it is the way it was negotiated with the plaintiffs, schools currently spend somewhere around 25% at the highest level. Okay. We're really talking now about the original Power Five schools. Okay. About 70 of them. They typically spend about 25%, 26% of their athletic budgets on their sports programs. Okay. So this arrangement was about getting them closer to 50%. So the 22% that you're talking about goes on top of the 25, and that's available to be spent on what we call institutional NIL, which means funding that's made available by the schools up to that 22% number, which is around $20 million in the first year. It gets adjusted every year going forward to spend on institutional NIL for student athletes. And the distribution on it will be driven to some extent um, by the revenue that's generated by the sports at the schools. But schools also need to incorporate sort of a legal standard around Title IX into that, which many of them will. And the other thing that no one's really talking about much here, Dave, which I think is important, we're uncapping all of the scholarship limits in Division One. So you're going to see literally thousands of new scholarships for men and women in college sports in D1 as part of this as well. And that doesn't, there's no limit on this. This is for all intents and purposes going to be the way this works going forward.
So there is no cap. This is just a bare minimum. These collectives can still come in with 10, $20 million on top of it.
So the way to think about, okay, so the way to think about this is the school piece is going to be this 22% piece, which on top of the 25 to 26 piece gets you pretty close to 50% of the budget spent on student athletes. The way it gets distributed to be determined by the schools. Separate from that, there's also an opportunity for student athletes to continue to benefit from what we would call third-party NIL, name, image, and likeness, like the local car dealership or EA Sports or Nike or sort of all the stuff that people have historically associated with traditional name, image, and likeness is still going to be available. That will all run any deal over $600. Okay. And that was a number, by the way, that was picked by student athletes. Any deal over $600 will have to go through sort of it's too fancy to call it a review process, but it's basically going to have to go through a clearinghouse and get approved. Because one of the things we want here is transparency and accountability around process. And that's why for the third party stuff, it's important to make sure there's a process here managed by Deloitte that every deal will have to go through and get approved, because there's all this stuff in the current world where kids get promised things that don't happen. People text things to people that don't materialize. We're really trying to create what I would describe as a grown-up process for this that kids and families can count on, as opposed to what we have now, which is so, in many cases, so tough on kids and families because there isn't any process transparency or any process accountability.
Yeah, the process was intended for players to profit off of their name, image, and likeness, selling jerseys, video games, appearances at car dealerships, you name it. It is anything but that from the coaches I talk to across the country on a regular basis. How would you describe NIL today?
Well, first of all, it's purely transactional. Okay. There's an enormous amount of stuff that takes place in which false promises are made to kids. I mean, if you look at the number of student athletes who enter the portal each year, with the idea of transferring, and the number who we track them pretty carefully, pretty closely, and the numbers who land somewhere, roughly 2/3 of them land somewhere, and the other third, we have trouble figuring out what happened to them. Now, it could very well be they landed someplace and we just don't know about it. But based on the stories and the anecdotal information that's out there, it's very clear that a lot of people make commitments to these kids. The kids go on the portal based on that commitment, and then the commitment doesn't actually turn out to be there. The thing we're trying to fix here is by creating an institutional NIL program, which is run by the schools. The schools care a lot about their relationships to student athletes, their credibility, their integrity with these kids. They need to build brand and hold brand with these kids. And there
Yeah.
will be transparency around that. And by creating this other clearinghouse for third party deals, it's going to be really hard for people to just lie and misrepresent because we do have examples now of student athletes. Some of them show up in the public domain, but a lot of them don't because they're embarrassed. Where people made promises to a lot of these kids and their families that don't materialize, and by the time they don't materialize, the kids have already left the school they were at, and they end up nowhere.
Yeah, I would describe it as a pay for play bleep show, just so we keep it from 4-letter words right now. It is a complete mess. So when you see a kid like Carson Beck, who's the former quarterback at Georgia, transferred to Miami for a $4 million deal, now is rumored to be receiving north of $10 million in NIL deals total. Is that something you like when you see Brock Purdy, the quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers, who makes dramatically less than that and he's played in a Super Bowl?
I guess my view on it, first of all, is I tend not to believe anything I hear about collegiate NIL. All right, I don't believe anything. And I thought Archie Manning's, not Archie Manning's, the
Arch.
Archer Manning's. I thought his grandfather's comment about this at the bowl game last year when people were saying, "Wow, geez, Arch is getting $2 million. He's the best paid backup quarterback in America," and 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 his grandfather said, I think he actually said it was bull bleep and went on to say, don't believe a word you hear about any of these numbers associated with what people are supposedly getting. People make stuff up all the time. The thing that our system will do is create some legitimate transparency around what's actually going on, which I think is important. And the other thing I would say here, Dave, because I think it's important, 99% of the kids who are participating in this collegiate NIL environment, both now and in the future, are not going to play very long, if at all, professionally. So,
Sure.
so I think part of this is important that we have a transparent and accountable system that's like managed for real, with a real relationship with schools and a real process for dealing with third parties, because a lot of these kids will justifiably have an opportunity to make some serious money. But the thing to remember here is the vast majority, 95, 96, 97% plus, are never going to play professionally. So we really need integrity in this process and some transparency in it, which we currently don't have. So the fact that, whatever Carson Beck's getting, bully for him, okay? But whether or not he'll have a professional career, who knows?
He'll get drafted. We're not sure.
Oh, I don't doubt
professional
that.
career would be.
I don't doubt that. But let's face it, the competitive, every single level, the competitive element gets higher and higher.
Yeah.
The number of kids coming out of high school who play college sports at all, at any division level, is like 7%.
Right.
Division I, it's like 4%. Top end of Division I, it's like 0.1. It's like 1/10 of 1%. So, and then you go to the pros, and it's another 1%.
No question. Politics threw a wrench into this because I think President Biden actually left what appeared to me to be a poison pill in this whole thing by forcing it to fall under Title IX, which would mean that 20 to 22 million would have to be dispersed among all athletes, including female athletes. And I am pro women's sports, but the money needs to go to for-profit, profit-generating sports. President Trump reversed that decision. Do you applaud that?
So the thing that the Biden administration put out was really not a rule. There's a process for making rules. You put out a rule. There's a formal process. People have an opportunity to respond. You typically have some sort of public hearing where folks can comment. You collect all the comments, and then you go back and you rework the rule, and then eventually you put out a final rule. What the Biden administration put out was more like an opinion piece. And I think the Trump administration basically pulled it back because it wasn't vetted. It didn't go through the traditional process. And whether or not they'll choose to have some sort of public process around this Title IX question or not, I don't know. But I certainly don't think what the Biden administration did was consistent with the way you typically make rules and regulations when it comes to Title IX and to other other federal law. And Title IX itself is broken up into a whole bunch of different parts, and which um, I'm assuming if the Trump people were to choose to do anything with this, would require some of the more typical process you go through when you're trying to create a rule. There's no question, if you look at the power schools, which is really where most of this conversation takes place, they typically make somewhere between 65 and 75% of all their revenue on football. Basketball, some make money on it. A lot of them break even on basketball. Some lose money on basketball, men's and women's. But they spend somewhere around 25, 30% of their budget on football. So football pays for a lot of other collegiate sports at a lot of those so-called Power Five, Power Four schools and institutions. And I think that has to be factored into the way people make decisions about how they deal with NIL. That said, we've been working to develop a fan database, which we now have 13.5 million fans in, which I think can become a really valuable asset in helping schools grow both attendance and viewership for a lot of the championships that historically and ultimately, hopefully, the conference tournaments and other key rivalry games in a lot of the sports that historically haven't gotten the same visibility that football and men's and women's basketball get.
Terrific. Glad to hear about that. Love to learn more about it. There's another aspect that impacts all this. Mark Lazary, who's the former owner of the Milwaukee Bucks, the founder of Avenue Capital, told me just a couple of months ago, minutes from here at the Westport Library in an interview, that he is actively bidding on college football and college basketball teams in which his company would own 51% of a particular program. It raised a lot of eyebrows. How would that impact the entire business? How would that impact, say, Michigan football if they had access to billions in capital?
Well, I guess I'd say two things about that. One is I'd like to get the settlement in place, right? Can we start by actually putting in place this thing people have been working on for years to actually rectify some of the historic issues that you raised earlier when we were talking? That would be me for goal number one. Like, let's do that and see how it works and make adjustments to it. And if people want to pursue other things, they can. I think the big thing I'd say about the private equity stuff, I know some schools are engaged in, some conferences are talking to folks about it. That's usually a 3 to 5 year window where those folks are looking to make a return. Schools tend to have a much longer runway, usually 10, 15, 20 years. So if people were to go down that road, they'd really have to figure out how it fits. And one of the things I have heard a number of the schools say, which I think is an important point, is if their football team or their basketball team or their women's basketball team or their baseball team, which actually generate a lot of visibility and attention at many schools, if they were to become majority owned by a private entity, they'd probably have a pretty hard time getting boosters and donors to support those programs. So the math on this, to me, is not exactly clear in terms of how it would work out. And most schools, even the ones with, $250 million athletic budgets, they spend it all. And they spend it all on programs and on kids and coaches and staff and facilities. And people would have to figure out where the margin's going to come from, because most of the people I know in private equity don't do it for free.
No, they do not. Do you think this happens in the next couple of years? It sounded from Mark to be very imminent.
Again, I'm not going to prognosticate on that one.
Fair.
My goal is to make sure that the settlement, which has huge implications for student athletes generally and college sports overall, gets implemented in a way that works for everybody who's involved. That to me is sort of goal number one for me anyway, and I think for a lot of my colleagues in college sports for the next 24 months or so.
All right, moving away from NIL, as a guy who covers the NCAA tournament for Turner Sports, some of the difficulty we have in breaking down games is we can't even remember where this guy played last year, and we follow the game all year. Player movement is a major issue. How do you solve it? Should these guys be required to sign contracts? What should be done with the transfer portal?
Well, I do think most of the kids who participate in the institutional NIL programs that schools have will probably be signing contracts, some probably for 1 year, some for more. And hopefully those will come with some sort of development plan, both academically and athletically for the student athletes that sign. Um, I do think I do think the that will create a different kind of look. I don't like the fact that the schools don't own the relationship anymore with the student athletes. And I don't like the fact that there's so much misrepresentation going on in this gray zone out here. So, to my way of thinking, if you have a process that's defined and that's accountable and transparent, and it's a two-way process between student athletes and schools, um, I think that gives us the possibility that kids will stick around because they have a plan, right? Like a real plan that, comes with certain goalposts to achieve athletically and academically and benefits associated with that. But the other thing I would say here is we forget about how much more kids transfer, period. Um, 35%, I think, was the last time I saw the numbers of all the kids who go to college transfer at least once. Um, Student athletes, it's more like 17%. So it's only about half as many kids who are playing college sports at D1 transfer as transfer generally across the student population. They have access to all kinds of data, all sorts of information. They're more used to that idea than certainly anybody was when I was going to school. Um, but I think for many folks, we're going to see this whole thing once we get away from this third party invisible. Remember, I said about a third of these kids, it's very hard to tell if they actually landed anywhere. I'm hoping we get to the point where if a kid does transfer, it's done in a way that's transparent and accountable, and they know why they're leaving and where they're going, and it's not going to be the way it's been. And I think we'll likely see a little less of that. But that said, I think it's incumbent on the schools and the programs to create what I would describe as a runway for student athletes to give them a reason to stay.
Yeah, rather than the free agency every year, which we have
Yeah,
now, which has
exactly.
chased out some of the great coaches, and now you have to re-recruit your own team each year, which I can't begin to imagine. Okay, one of the biggest issues facing the NCAA as well, President Trump reversing a decision that will no longer allow transgender athletes to play in women's sports, which has been controversial over the last couple of years, played into the presidential election. Are you satisfied with the decision? And by the way, Riley Gaines, who has been one of the most outspoken voices on here, says even that decision has more loopholes than Swiss cheese. She fears there will still be transgender athletes competing in women's sports.
I don't agree with her on that one. I don't think that's true. We spent a long time talking to our board of governors and to our membership about this issue, and we made pretty clear to our colleagues at the federal level that the lack of a national standard here was a big problem. You had a bunch of states where it was at the state level, transgender athletes could not participate in women's sports. And yet at the same time, you had decision after decision being issued by federal judges in favor of participation. I testified in front of Congress and made clear to Congress. I was there for a sports betting hearing, but this issue came up, and I made clear to those folks that having a single national standard on this issue would be very helpful to us. We're talking about an incredibly small number of student athletes to begin with. There are 510,000 student athletes. There are less than 10 that we know of who are transgender athletes participating in college sports. And the administration, with the regulation they issued on the DOE side and with the Department of Education side and with the executive order that was issued by the president, gave us clarity on a national standard. And we plan to comply with it. And we believe by complying with it, we will satisfy the intent of that executive order.
A lot of this started because of Leah Thomas, the swimmer who was dominating female swimming, a transgender racer. Should her records be erased?
I think the issue with my answer to that one is um, we normally don't go back and rewrite records and rules. We
Mm-hmm.
just don't. I mean, um, this issue's come up a lot over the course of the last, call it 100 years, where people have wanted, based on rule changes, to go back and change all kinds of rules. Historically, that's not been something that the professional ranks or the collegiate ranks have done.
So, shifting to the NCAA tournament, my personal favorite sporting event on the planet, just a
Mine
few
too.
weeks away, and I know it's just the best. A lot of talk about expanding to 76 teams from the current 68. Do you in favor that expansion? Do you fear that it will water down the competition? There are very few exceptions. Maybe one in every 5 years, there's a great team who's not allowed, but I would say there's more often the mistake goes in the other way. There are some mediocre teams that already get in 68. Do you fear the watering down of the competition? Do you like the 76? And could it open the door to home games like women's basketball does? Or would Duke's Cameron Indoor Stadium, the greatest venue, but the smallest, would that disallow it?
So there's a lot of questions. That was a
Yeah,
lot
there's a
of
lot of
questions, Dave.
questions.
Let me start with the first one, which is remember we have the men's and women's basketball tournaments have something that's pretty unique, which is every conference gets an automatic qualifier, right? So we start with 32 automatic qualifiers in the men's and women's tournament. Many of those automatic qualifiers, they win a tournament, they win a conference tournament, they win a conference championship, and they're in. Many of them would be part of the field of 68 anyway. Many of them are outside the field of 68, but that's where the fun starts, right? With respect to what happens when you get into the tournament. I think when we talk about going from 68 to 76, part of it's about giving some of the schools that weren't conference championship winners, but would certainly be considered among the best 70 or 80 schools in the country in that season, an opportunity to get into the tournament and prove themselves. This is only going to work if we can figure out a way to make the math work. And that's a function of some ongoing negotiations and discussions we've been having with our partners, CBS and WBD, TNT, one of yours. I think for us, the window's there. It's a small window, but it's there. And I do believe that a bunch of the schools that end up on the bubble, right, are schools that probably would have gotten in if we didn't have an AQ program. But we are going to maintain an AQ program because it's a hugely important part of what makes the tournament interesting to people. But if we could figure out a way to make the math work, to go to 76 on the men's and women's side, and to give some schools that would otherwise probably be in the top 70 programs in the country in a given year, we'd like to give that a shot. We'll see what happens.
If there's any dark side to the NCAA tournament, and there's not many, you mentioned it earlier because you were on Capitol Hill talking about it, the impact of gambling and in particular prop bets related to college athletes. How big a problem is it for student athletes today? What are you doing about it?
So the first thing we do is we track more games every year than anybody else anywhere, for integrity purposes. And I think um, that to us is sort of goal number one, to have as an aggressive and integrity program as we possibly can. So if we do see unusual circumstances around betting or performance or substitutions, whatever it might be, we're in a position to actually do something about that. And if need be, notify law enforcement, which has happened in the past. The second thing is when we go into our tournaments, especially the major ones, we contract with a third party who makes it possible for us to track all of the social media traffic that's directed at student athletes in our tournaments. And my God, Dave, it's unbelievable the beatdown that's delivered on a lot of these young people. And almost all of it involves their individual performance, not as a function of whether or not the team won or lost the game, but whether or not they hit a prop. Armando Bacot, North Carolina, a couple of years ago, I thought had the best line of all. He said, "Look, we won the game." He said this in his press conference afterwards. "We won the game. I had a pretty good game, but I didn't get the number of rebounds I was supposed to get according to the prop bet, and so I got skewered in my direct messages and on social media." And if you go just for fun sometime, go sit behind the bench at one of these major college basketball games and just listen to the vitriol that gets spit at these kids over issues around their individual performance. And, if there's one thing I believe about college sports, is it teaches you how to be part of a team, and why being part of a team and being able to help your team succeed is the lesson that later on in life you will benefit from time and time and time again. And putting these kids in this position where their individual performance overshadows their team performance, and letting these jerks get away with the kind of beatdown that they deliver. I mean, you literally have kids who have people sending them their Venmo and telling them that they owe them, right, through Venmo, or saying, "I know where you live. I know what dorm you're in. I know what building you come out of when you go to class. I'm going to be there. I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to kill you." I mean, crazy stuff. And we've managed to get a bunch of states to walk away from it. We're to the point now where I think less than half the states that have legalized sports betting have legalized prop betting on collegiate sports, but we still have a lot of work to do on this one.
Indeed. One of the great stories in college sports.
It is bad news. It really is.
Bad news. One of the good stories in college basketball, Cooper Flag at Duke. But honestly, the biggest story this year has been the SEC. 3 of the top 4, 5 of the top 7, 9 of the top 25, have projected 13 teams in the NCAA tournament. The SEC is a basketball or a football conference, and how'd they get here?
You'd probably be better off talking to Greg Sankey, who's the commissioner of the SEC, than talking to me about it. I will say that, from what I've heard, based on conversations I've had with people around the conference and with Greg, is they made a conscious decision a few years ago to get better in basketball. And on men's basketball and women's basketball, they've gotten dramatically better in both. And some of that was about coaching. Some of it was about, the conference investing in the programming. Some of it was about thinking harder and doing a better job around how they recruit. But overall, it's a heck of a story. And the one thing I'll say about it is, the great thing about college basketball is it does have this tendency over time to morph a bit. And I think that's what keeps the tournament and the sport fresh. And I'm actually looking forward to whatever the next chapter, the next act looks like. And I love the 5-12 and the 13-4 and the 14-3 games where something unusual happens. But I also really admire the fact that the SEC decided we wanted to be good in basketball, and they went about figuring it out. Same way the Big East did, and the same way the ACC has, and the same way over time the Big Ten and the Big 12 has a lot of really good basketball teams in it. So I'm actually pretty excited about the whole thing.
I shouldn't leave out the great story that is Rick Pitino at 72, bringing his 6th team to the NCAA tournament. One of my personal favorite stories. 2 quick ones because I know you're about out of time and they're fun ones. You are a big music fan. I know this from friends who have told me. Kendrick Lamar played the halftime show. Some people loved it. Some people, like myself, were still trying to learn what the diss track was. Who would you love to see? One band you would love to see, or individual artist, to play the halftime show at the Super Bowl?
It's funny you should say that because a lot of the bands that I would have wanted to see, or artists I would have wanted to see play the Super Bowl, have, because it's been going on for 50 years. Um, but if I had to pick one on it, look, I have a whole family full of Taylor Swift fans. And there's nobody who can play a concert venue like she can. And she has a lot of musical allies. I mean, she could put together something I think that would be pretty special and pretty unique. Um, yeah, I'll start there.
I have a family full of Swifties as well. Were you bummed she got booed?
I look, the being famous comes with that sort of thing. I had a lot of people when I was governor protesting outside my house about one thing or another. It's just comes with the territory.
Yeah, I think
But
she's got some thick skin. I would take Morgan Wallen. He would be my choice because I think he would bring together the musical world.
he would be great now. And he's also another terrific collaborator, right? He's one of those guys who sings songs and writes songs and performs songs with all sorts of other people. He could bring a real posse to that thing. And that to me is what I would want more than anything, which is somebody who will give you, what they bring, but they'll also bring a whole bunch of their fellow performers who will turn the thing, because it's a stadium show, who will turn it into something that's much bigger than just them.
Yeah, I think that would be a great moment for the country. Final question.
Let's get
I am
Morgan
in
Wallen and
Westport.
Post Malone and a whole bunch of others out there together. Yeah.
There you go. Absolutely. So I'm here in Westport. Your wife is from Westport. I know you spent a lot of great time here. Share with me some of the memories, whether it be Mitchell's or Campo or restaurants or anything you remember so fondly.
Well, I certainly, as you and I talked about before, there's nothing like walking into Mitchell's, which is a clothing store that's been a family-owned clothing store in Westport. It's been there for a million years. But you walk in the door there and they treat you, they could have seen you a week ago and they treat you like they haven't seen you in a year. And if they haven't seen you in a year, they still remember your name, your shoe size, what size pants you wear. I mean, they're just the greatest, nicest people ever. The Little Kitchen, which is a Chinese restaurant, my wife and I and my late in-laws used to get, and our kids used to get takeout food from there forever. And when our kids were little, we used to play a lot at Campo Beach. And there's nothing like watching a bunch of little kids dig in the sand and playing the surf. And Campo is a great beach for that.
It is a special place. It's a wonderful town. We can't wait to have you back. We also have one of the best libraries in the country that has turned into an event space that would love to host an interview with Charlie Baker. Anytime you want, the stage is yours, sir.
All right, I will keep that in mind. And obviously, my wife would have no problem with taking a trip to Westport.
Sounds great.
Very
You can stay
familiar
with
territory for her. Yeah.
You can stay with us. We got a couple of new hotels since you've been here as well. He is the president of the NCAA. He is the former governor of Massachusetts. One guy sitting right here hopes he's the future president of the United States, but we won't press him on that. But if you need a comms director when you run for president, I'm signing up. All right.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate that.
Thank you,
Care.
Charlie. Good to see you.
See ya.